Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. My name is Nick Messmer, and in this episode, I sit down with some of my friends from Bob Jones University to talk about how to refresh your Greek curriculum. So this episode is an interview that I had with some of the Greek teachers and faculty at Bob Jones University, where they recently pretty significantly refreshed their Greek curriculum. And part of that was incorporating more communicative methods by using Biblingo. So this is a really exciting episode because earlier this year, we did a whole podcast series on biblical language pedagogy, which if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend. And this is, at least in part, an example of someone listening to that podcast and really taking it to heart and testing out some of what we talked about. So this episode, I think, will be particularly helpful to maybe teachers or faculty at institutions that teach biblical Greek or Hebrew, but I think it will also be interesting and even insightful for really anyone who's studying Greek and Hebrew, because we really get into a lot of discussion on pedagogy and curriculum and different approaches and motivation and outcomes and things like that. So before we dive in, I did have just one quick announcement. If you've been following our most recent series that we just wrapped up on lexical semantics, we actually just hosted a live webinar recently called How to Do Lexical Semantics, and it really was taking a lot of that we covered in the podcast and just diving really, really deep. It gets a little bit more technical. It being a webinar, we're able to use slides that make it a bit easier to talk about more technical things, looking at data, to do analysis and things like that. It really adds a lot to the podcast series and gets really, really practical. The people that joined got to ask some really practical questions about, okay, so how do I go and do this? So highly recommend. You can watch the recording for the webinar on Biblingo's YouTube channel. So because of the slides that we use and things like that, we aren't posting it as a podcast episode, but you can find it on Biblingo's YouTube channel. It's just called How to Do Lexical Semantics. So with that, we will go ahead and dive into this episode. Hey, I'm Nick Messmer with Biblingo, and I'm here with my friends from Bob Jones University. And today we're going to be talking about the biblical languages, pedagogy, curriculum, and how all of that is working here at BJU. So why don't you guys first introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you do here at BJU.
I'm Esdras Borges, and I'm a Greek GA. Just finished working on my master's and thinking about starting further education, and in the meantime, just teaching Greek.
I'm Dan Olinger. I'm Division Chair of Biblical and Theological Studies, and I'm the old guy.
Great.
I'm Timothy Hughes, and I serve in the Office of Ministerial Advancement at BJU. I'm also assistant professor and team lead for the Greek project Refresh, which we made up. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off just by saying that I know BJU has a strong heritage of emphasizing the biblical languages. So do you guys want to share a little bit about that heritage and what it's looked like up to this point in time?
Sure. Very strong heritage. My teachers in Hebrew and Greek here in the seminary were 3 student-teacher generations removed from Robert Dick Wilson in Hebrew at Princeton and A.T. Robertson in Greek at Southern. I often remind myself that the fact that somebody was somebody else's student doesn't mean that he was a good student, but it's nice to have that connection. I minored in Greek, as an awful lot of the Bible majors did back in those days. That was 40 years ago. And the Greek program was rigorous. It was also fairly progressive, and by that I mean we were pulling in inductive teaching techniques for the biblical languages before it was cool. I remember going home to my Christian high school at Christmas break, first semester, and talking to my classmates who were attending a number of other evangelical colleges around the country and taking Greek. And we were comparing notes, and I mentioned that we were translating. And they looked at me in wonder. You're translating? We've just been memorizing paradigms all this time. And I said, yeah, we wanted to get in the shallow end of the pool and do some translation work. In Hebrew, we did the same thing, but more so. And Hebrew, I tell people, was the only course I ever took in my life where I was completely lost for an extended period of time. And then at 9 weeks, all of a sudden, everything clicked. And my professor called it, we're coming out of the woods. You've been in the woods, and now you're out of the woods. So they were looking at that heavily inductive approach early on, and the program was quite strong because of that. I sort of lost touch with the program for a few years. I was somewhere else and doing other things. And I'll have more to say, we'll have more to say later about some of the concerns we had in the current program and the reason for trying to innovate, to do some things to update it.
Yeah, and I think to pick up from the 60s and going into the 80s, is that where we're at?
70s.
70s and going in.
Come on, man.
Yeah, sorry. So in the 80s, Dr. Sam Schneider, who was a boss of mine and a teacher of mine. So when I was doing what Ezra's doing about a decade ago, Sam Schneider was my boss, and he was the department head. And years before, like in the 80s, the guys at the time, including him, looked at what was available on the market. They wanted like a modified deductive inductive approach. And now there's all kinds of stuff that is right in the vein of what they were looking for at the time. But the time period they were looking for, they weren't finding a lot of that kind of stuff. I mean, right now, whenever an elementary Greek text is published, there's always an apology in the front matter. Why another Greek text? That's the way they all start. It wasn't necessarily like that in the 80s. So BJU developed our own curriculum. So that sprung up in the 80s. It landed in its 5th edition, was the most recent edition. And at the time, that was an innovation. What starts out as an innovation can become a tradition long about the 5th edition. And so at some point you find yourself having serious conversations about, this is where we're at, is this where we need to go? But we're really grateful for our heritage. We recently met with Dr. Schneider and said, here's what we're doing. He's like, you go get him. Yeah. So that was good. That was cool.
Another major influence in our program in more recent years has been Randy Leedy. And Leedy is famous for the Greek New Testament diagrams that were in Bible Works and have since been ported over into Logos. And he had a lot to do with carrying the program through that intervening period.
So that's a good segue as well. Recently, BJU has conducted kind of a refresh of the Greek curriculum. So wanted to talk about that a little bit, but to start off, what were some of the main kind of specific reasons that you started to think, hey, maybe something should change here?
Well, the process itself was really organic. We were joking around before we started the podcast. I just recently changed my email folder from Greek textbook project. That's really, it just started as a set of conversations. Our dean, Kevin Oberlin, really likes to fuel innovation and conversations. He's really good about that, and a lot of good things are happening because of that. When it came to Greek, it was just somebody started a conversation. Mikhail Romer, who was a Greek fellow before Ezra was.
For 7 years, which is, I think, an institutional record.
Yeah, so he was working on a PhD and teaching Greek, and sort of on his way out, he had a forum to share with us things he'd observed, and so we started talking about what might need to change. We were concerned about the number of students that were failing classes or that were barely passing, and we just thought we get it. There's always going to be somebody that struggles, but why is this much? We were concerned. Yeah.
Providentially, right as we were thinking about that, they had a section they needed covered, and I said, I've always wanted to teach Greek. Why don't I take a section of 101? It'll be fun in my dotage, So I took a section, and I was astonished at the level of fear of Greek. It's a memorization project. There's a way to do memorization. You just hit it regularly. Keep coming back to it. And the guys, the attrition rate was huge. There were bodies in the streets, it was really brutal to watch. And I think I lost half of that section, dropped in the course of that semester. And that just reinforced what we'd been talking about. We said, we got to do something about this.
So that was one of the things we felt that on another level, the textbook had many strengths. There were some updates that were needed linguistically, we felt, and even editorially, and it left to the individual teacher all of the, what I call, among Greek teachers, I call the rah-rah stuff, where you're learning a new paradigm or learning a new concept, and you really need someone to come along and show you a cool place in the Bible where it makes a difference. And then all of the pieces like, how do you choose a Greek text, and how do you interact with software? And so we wanted something, we knew we needed to be doing that stuff, and the individual teachers were working on it. But as we began to think about a textbook, we were thinking about some of these things. And so we said we need to have the textbook conversation. And then it's like someone wisely paused us and said, wait a second, that is not the first conversation we need to have. And so at that point, we brought in Dr. Doug Garland, who has an EDD, who had done our Greek program when he was a student, had gone through it, and sort of became a lifelong user of Greek, which is awesome. But he is also really key to all of our assessment and academic structure and curriculum projects. He wrote his dissertation on how to choose a textbook, in that process. So he came in, and what we did was we put the textbook conversation aside, and we had a ground-up conversation about what's our vision for these 4 courses. We also have a minor. We have seminary Greek classes, we have book classes, exegesis classes, but we got focused on the foundation. Let's look at these 4 courses like a program and develop a vision statement and program learning outcomes.
On these house renovation shows, they come into a house and they say, okay, we're going to need to fix this, and we're going to do these things. And then they start the work, and they discover there's a mold problem, there's a termite problem, and before you know it, the whole building's gutted. And we're starting over. That's kind of what happened to us.
And I would actually, that sounds like a scary thing, but I listen to your podcast, and I listen through a certain lens, and so I'm thinking about some of the people that are listening. If you're like the one person in your institution who is like saying, we need to do this, if you can get a supportive dean and start a conversation, going to this level of vision and program learning outcomes actually gives you a ton of credibility in the institution, frankly. Mm-hmm. Just the fact that Doug was involved, that Dr. Oberlin was fueling and letting us pull together the faculty. And when you come out and you say, we've actually thought the ground up about our program learning outcomes, that gives you a level of credibility. It's even if you don't come out switching textbook or doing some wildly different approach, it's so healthy for your program. And anyone that knows anything about higher education knows that if you've gone through a process like that, anything you say after that is well considered. It's not a shoot from the hip. This is the way we've always done it. Right. Even if you don't change that much, your program is going to have more credibility by taking the time to set up some meetings and walk through this this process of just taking a 360 view and everything's on the table.
Right. And, we're looking at the fear problem. And the obvious response to that is we need to work on affective outcomes. We need to change the way our students feel when they approach Greek so that it becomes a friend for life instead of a breakup in high school that they've never been able to put out of their minds, get over, right? So going back to the outcomes and saying we got to rework the whole thing was absolutely the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I want to get to the outcomes specifically and some of the kind of nitty-gritty of the process. But just one thing as you're talking that strikes me is I think it's pretty incredible how many people came in on the project. And it sounds like without too much friction kind of bought into at least the process like you mentioned. And I completely agree. The series I think you were referencing that we did on biblical language pedagogy, one of the main things was that whether you change your desired outcome or not, most people don't have clarity on what their actual outcomes they're aiming at are. And even just gaining clarity on that, I think, is really key. But, I mean, that so many people were buying into the process is striking because of the heritage in a lot of ways, and that you all were on your 5th edition of your own textbook. I mean, that's really amazing that there was a willingness to kind of question that. Another thing that came up on our podcast series was the idea of lock-in. And I can't imagine being more locked in to a curriculum than one that has been created at your institution and used for so many years. So, I mean, what do you think was at the heart of the openness to
grace?
Yeah.
Divine grace.
Yeah.
There were all kinds of carnal reasons to protect turf and to say, we're not going to do, and everybody just said it was a. I don't like to overuse the word miracle. I'm in theology. Okay.
You're the one that taught me the difference between.
Yes, but it was providential. God did it, and it was an exciting thing to be a part of.
It was interesting that I'm the GA guy, the new guy, and I'm very shy in this whole process. And I had all these ideas, and they're saying we need to improve effective outcomes. And when I was going through the program, I was like, this thing is a pain. Like, I've learned other languages, and I had a ton of fun, and Greek is just a pain. I just want to endure these 3-6 semesters, and then after that, I'm going to do my own thing and have fun. And when I actually noticed that they were willing to hear those ideas and do something about it, I was like, I can't believe this.
Yeah.
Like,
This guy was an idea fountain. I mean, he just kept coming up with this stuff, and we're going,
it was marinating in my mind, and I was just like, I'm not going to say anything because they're not going to hear it.
Which is another thing. You may think you're, there's only 1 or 2 people that think like this. Once there's permission to have the conversation, you don't know who's going to come out of the woodwork and be an MVP on your team. Like that's,
Yeah, that's good. Let's talk more about that. As you were diving into the process, you mentioned you started with kind of clarifying your outcomes and things like that. So what were the sorts of outcomes that you came up with? What were the kind of ideas being brought to the table, and what were you considering and sifting through? Let's kind of get into the nitty-gritty.
well, the big outcome is we want these people to use Greek effectively, accurately, for the rest of their lives. And in order to get there, they have to love Greek. They have to have a relationship with it that is positive. So we need to create enjoyable, positive experiences and memories that are more than just, what's the word for thinking fondly about old times? Nostalgia. Yeah. It's more than just nostalgia for, we were in a prison camp together, those were the good old days.
You asked the question earlier, and I think this connects. What, how did everyone actually come together around this? I think part of the answer is there's a culture here from the leadership that keeps talking to us about student success. Like, this is one of the big things we're supposed to be thinking about, student success. And we were looking at our Greek program and looking at some of the carnage, to be melodramatic, and thinking, all right, student success, we could say, well, they need to work harder, but there's things we can do.
Kids these days.
Yeah. So we're like, we're not going to do the kids these days thing. We're gonna really say, what can we do to aid student success? So I think that being in the culture really helped us to have a more effective conversation, and then that naturally takes you to the effective outcomes. And teachers, we are so used to thinking about cognitive outcomes, and we sometimes miss the affective domain. So we had some really good coaching about that, and Dr. Garland really helped us think about that and how we could even assess that. And so that kind of gave us permission to make a major plank of our new learning outcomes be an effective outcome. So we started saying, how do we want students to feel about this? What do we want to change under the hood in their heart and their attitude towards Greek? And we came out, I mean, a lot of our outcomes didn't change that much. There were changes that looked subtle and maybe weren't as subtle, but a lot of them were the same. Vocabulary, grammar, exegesis. We rephrased some things. I would say the biggest change, the biggest, most obvious change was we started saying we want to produce lifelong learners and lovers of the Greek New Testament, lifelong engagement. We want people to come out of Greek class saying, where can I take more Greek? I mean, that's one of the ways we're going to measure this. How many do we get more minors?
You can't assess effectively by waiting 40 years and seeing whether they're still using their Greek. You have to assess immediately. So Doug, the assessment guy, said things like, okay, how many of your students who aren't Greek minors become Greek minors after they've had some exposure to the program? Well, you can measure that.
And when you start with a new effective outcome like that, or a newly phrased one, or a newly elevated and prioritized one, and then you realize what your metrics are going to be, then you back up and you say, well, okay, what do we have to do the first day we walk into the classroom to cultivate that spirit and that kind of desire for continued engagement? And so backing up, eventually that gets down to the assignment level,
And then you also can measure, we have this category in the syllabus where students are required to spend 90 minutes a week just doing, interacting with the language, and they're using Biblingo for that. And so you see a lot of students who are doing maybe 200 minutes. And so they're going beyond that minimum requirement, and you can tell, okay, maybe they're enjoying the language and they're going further.
And well, I'm about to rush ahead of where the conversation
That's okay.
is. So
Well, I would love to hear more from you about some of the ideas that you were shyly bringing to the table as well.
The first one probably in my mind was crazy. We used to have four classes a week. So it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. And my first suggestion was we should get rid of Tuesday class because the students are not learning Greek in the classroom. You don't learn a language from a teacher. The teacher doesn't teach the language. He coaches you through the learning process. And so the student has to be proactive in looking his sources and interacting with the language and finding something that works for him outside of the classroom if he's going to learn the language. So why don't we free up some time and then use that time for the students to interact with the language. So that was the first crazy idea. And that's what the modern languages in the university did a few years ago when I was going through French. And so that was my first idea. And then the other one was to create this category where they can immerse in the language. And at that point, I didn't really know what that would look like. I knew about Biblingo and I was thinking it would be great. And I was very shy. Like I was so shy about proposing that I mentioned it very briefly in the meeting and sent an email with a video presentation that you made and sent it to them. And I was like, okay, nobody reacted.
It just went, it's like it went right past us. I don't even.
So I was like, okay, we're done talking about Biblingo. Maybe I should make some visual flashcards or something.
Yeah.
But then when Timothy found out about Biblingo, he started talking about it. I was like, but like, is this a conversation we can actually have? And he was like, well, let's see if it works, and then let's figure out a way it can work with Bob Jones.
Yeah.
So those are, I think, two main ideas. And then the other one, dealing with the fear factor, was that I noticed a lot of students, they have a lot of anxiety about quizzes and tests. And so I thought of maybe it would be more efficient to create question banks for each chapter, and then using the randomizing feature in Canvas to select random questions from each question bank and have cumulative tests on Canvas, but allowing them 10 opportunities to take each quiz. So they can take each vocab quiz, each grammar quiz about 10 times, and each time the quiz looks different. But they have a chance to get the grade that they desire without, being punished by.
And old school teachers are really against that, viscerally. Why would you let the kid keep taking the quiz? But it was pointed out to me, the more they take the quiz, the more they're interacting with the language. They're learning more in the quiz process.
They're doing spaced repetition.
And so if eventually they get to 95% after 10 tries, what are you upset about? That's where you wanted them to be,
And each quiz looks different. It's not the same quiz.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
Ezra brought to us a chart comparing the grammar translation method, which is our strongly entrenched tradition. If to the point where if you were motivated, gifted, you were going to study hard, and you wanted to go somewhere and get grammar translation method Greek, and you wanted to go far with it, this was a great place to come. Moise Silva did his undergrad here, and not that we would take credit for all that has come from his ministry, but I assume that the Greek was helpful as a starting point here. I mean, you could do that and do very well. So, but that method has some weaknesses to it, and Ezra laid them out very helpfully for us: strengths and weaknesses, and then a living language approach and some pros and cons there. And we were looking at this, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from taking. And I'm not trying to say it would be wrong to take the full plunge to living language. We weren't ready to make a full plunge, but we looked at this and said we have to integrate the best of both approaches. You may not be in a spot to turn the language program at your school on its head, but nobody is going to oppose, hopefully, some program innovation. So I think, just to recapture some of the things we talked about, we built in spaced repetition. Hopefully you're doing that anyway, but we got maybe even more intentional about spaced repetition. You guys talk a lot about pollination and the 4 strands and that fluency building part, as he defines it. I think some of the quizzing mechanisms that are built in, now being built into each of these semesters, some of it was already happening, but being really intentionally built through every part of the program, that's a fluency building thing. Flipping the classroom is another thing I don't think we've mentioned yet, that really frees us up in the classroom to do more communicative things, to do more fluency building things, to do more actual engagement. So we flip.
Have fun. We have fun in the classroom.
Flipped classroom, space repetition, fluency building, and then incorporation of some communicative elements. So at that point, that's where things really got interesting. We heard about Biblingo. Ezra had already heard about it, and we didn't pay any attention. I don't know why. And then it came up again, and we got really serious about this conversation because we knew we needed to incorporate some communicative elements. And in our minds, we were going to be sitting around making this up from scratch ourselves. And there's only so far we could have gone with that. And when we started looking into you guys and started talking with you guys, we realized you had been very, very intentional about what you had built, and you had a strong product. And so then we just had to think about, can our students afford this? What kind of pricing? Like all those, it became a logistics thing, and it ended up working out very well.
And
Logistics are a lot easier to figure out than the conceptual stuff.
And the way it looks is, if you're trying to use a textbook, we're using Merkle Plummer. And that's essentialist enough that it allows the teacher room to personalize, but it also covers some things. Our curriculum was even more essentialist and didn't have some of the rah-rah and some different things. So we use that, but we flip the classroom, so a lot of the engagement with the textbook or even video lectures or whatever happens outside of class. And a lot of actual jumping into the language happens in the classroom. We have these quizzes in this pedagogical structure with the spaced repetition and the fluency building going on. And BibLingo actually became sort of like the out-of-classroom language engagement, multi-sensory experience for them communicatively. They're hearing the pronunciation. We switched to reconstructed Koine. They're hearing the
That was
pronunciation.
another crazy idea.
Well, they switched to reconstructed Koine. I got 50 years of Erasmian, and
He's got this
I'm still working on it.
He's got this slightly reconstructed Koine. But and that's the thing. You don't have to. We've taken a step. We're not beating everybody over the head with 2x4 saying you mispronounced that diphthong. Teacher-wise, but the students, every day they're hearing BibLingo's reconstructed Koine pronunciations. They're doing the work. There's a vocab module they can use. They're doing input, they're doing output, and so they come to the classroom, and this is where I need to stop. And so, but that's where BibLingo fit in.
The thing that really works about BibLingo is we all know that the way you learn anything is regular spaced repetition. That's how actors learn their lines. It's how we memorize Bible. That's the way you learn. Well, and so in the old system of Greek, the way I learned Greek and the way these guys learned it was you drilled those paradigms. And if you do it every day, it becomes second nature. The problem is nobody does it every day because it's burdensome. It's not fun. And the highly disciplined among us, the marathon runners, they'll do it and they'll excel. But most people just haven't got the joy in their hearts to do that grunt work every day. Well, if you make the repetition fun, the thing that they're doing every day is fun. So we tell them, okay, you've got a subscription to BibLingo. You have to do something every day. And we say 5 days a week. I think we started with 6 and backed it off to 5. We give them the Lord's Day off for the Sabbatarians among us, But they got to do 5 days a week. We don't say how much every day. They have to get full credit, they need to do 90 minutes a week. And we all know that works better if they split it up into 5 packages of equal size. But we don't enforce that. And so every day they're playing games and watching the little movies and typing in the sentences, and picking the right thing that's going on. And it's fun. They enjoy it. And it's just a few minutes. And that has completely revolutionized their degree of preparedness when they come into class. They understand. And what I really like about it is, he mentioned we're using Merkel and Plummer. BibLingo is not aligned with any traditional curriculum. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. My students came into class the other day and said, how come we're doing third declension nouns in BibLingo and we haven't gotten to them in class? And I said, you'll be ready when we get to them. You've been exposed to them. Just have fun with it, play in the sandbox, and don't worry. They can learn it just as well from BibLingo as they can from the book. So both of those experiences are reinforcing each other. And the key component that BibLingo brings into it is that desire for daily interaction. That solves that problem.
Yeah, and I think our thinking on this is, you guys have implemented the 4 strands. We had one of those strands down very well, and we're very comfortable with it. So it's fine with us that you guys do language-focused learning, but we're not focused like the other 3 strands that you guys deliver. That's the reason we engaged with BibLingo, if that makes sense. And so, And in a more communicative approach rather than a traditional sequencing, you learn words like bird and cup. You get petenon and poterion and words like this maybe before you get demon, right? Yeah. And so your traditional sequencing, it doesn't matter if it's an abstract word because you're learning an English gloss, and you don't have to move from concrete to abstract. And so the sequencing is different. And obviously in a communicative approach, you learn your nominatives and your accusative singulars first, and you don't learn the whole paradigm right away necessarily. And that's just how it works. And if you do a modern language through Duolingo or something like that, it's the same thing. And so we get at the sequencing. The sequencing of both is deliberate. And we just sort of, we don't pull our hair out that it doesn't exactly match up. And I mean, Nick, you've done some thinking about this. At what point would you say those things, at what point would you say that in terms of vocab and grammar concepts, it's pretty much, it all just, when did the lines become intersecting lines again?
I mean, Biblingo as a whole are lessons. I mean, currently we have 32 that covers roughly 2 semesters worth. And if you look at the curriculum as a whole compared to any other curriculum as a whole, they cover all the same stuff. So it's totally the order that's different. And so I would say you'll start noticing, and in a lot of areas, it actually is very similar. So like for verbs, we'll start with present, just like any other curriculum. So, students will start to notice, I would say just in the first 4, 5, 6 lessons, they'll start to get some mutual reinforcement. But I would say definitely, toward the end of the first semester, so lessons like 12 to 15, most of the grammar should have kind of like synced up for the most part. The vocabulary, maybe not quite as much, but there will be a good bit of overlap. But then as you get into second semester, you'll start, the vocab will really start lining up as well. And yeah, I think that can be difficult in some ways for students because it's a little bit more that they're learning. But like you mentioned, the reinforcement that starts to happen, I think, is from both ends. So what they've learned in Biblingo getting reinforced through the textbook will be really helpful, and what they're learning in the textbook being reinforced.
I'm not sure that it is difficult. I think if we were heavily testing them over both tracks, but the way we're using it,
I tell them, I'm not going to test you over anything in Biblingo. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to use it. And like you mentioned, what matters is having fun, putting the time in, getting daily engagement. That's really what it's all about. Just a couple thoughts on some of that. I love the way you're doing the quizzing. I never thought about that before, but the reason I think it's so important actually is the concept of building fluency at every stage. The issue is if they're failing a test, they're not fluent with that material, and then if they have to just move on,
and then we're going on.
That's what happens. They get left behind. Then they're discouraged. They're trying to catch up. And if you're still trying to catch up on what's before, you're definitely not building fluency with the new stuff. So if you're forcing them to get 95% before they move on virtually, then you're kind of ensuring that everyone's developing some measure of fluency with the material before moving on.
I think in any kind of subject matter that's serialized, like math or language, you have to get the earlier stuff in order to get the later stuff. Those of us, I'm a STEM person, really, by nature. I was a math person in K-12. We think, well, you can't introduce anything that you haven't prepared them for. You got to do everything exactly in order. Well, people aren't machines, and we don't learn languages in that mechanical way. So getting misaligned a little bit and introducing something over here we're not talking about yet over here isn't a problem. It's not a bug. It's a feature, and that's not something you want to fix. See, so so far it's been working really well.
And would you like to talk about the first test experience? Because I think as far as the tests on the textbook material, we're still very traditional. We're still asking them to parse and write out paradigms and translate. So how was your experience with the first test?
Mixed. Some students, a couple of students had real difficulty with the first test. I'm going to give the second one in just a couple of days. And I suspect that the ones who had trouble in the first test are probably going to come around on the second one. But overall, I find that the way to enable them to do the paradigms is not so much to drill them on the paradigms. It's to give them fluency experiences. I was talking to you yesterday and mentioned I had a kid in class who couldn't remember third person singular, but he said it's the lower left corner, you know, and he was thinking spatially rather than grammatically. But whatever route that information follows to get into their understanding, as long as it works, I'm happy. But it's more likely to work if it isn't, if the experience of getting it into their heads isn't a drudgery.
I think overall, the early signs are that our retention in the program, you know, I mean, you said that your two experiences, the previous section of 101 contrasted with this overall retention.
The first section of 101 I taught, I lost half the students. They dropped. Yeah. And as I say, blood running in the streets. It was depressing. This semester, I've had a couple of students drop. But 8-9 weeks in, right now, everybody's passing. Yeah. Everybody. Yeah. And I look at that and I say, that's never happened before, you know, in the history of Greek pedagogy. I'm exaggerating, but the change has been dramatic. And I've had multiple students tell me that Greek is their favorite course. And these aren't the kids who are beasting it. Of course, if you're getting an A, you know, Greek is your favorite course. But these are kids who are more realistic in their experience. Yeah. And yet they're really having a good time. They look forward to coming to class.
You know, I think in life sometimes, this just isn't always true, but go big or go home kind of comes to mind. So back in the days when I was a Greek GA or Greek fellow like Ezra, you know, I would have these classes, and we actually had some pretty good experiences the old way, but you got to go big or go home. I mean, so we were singing paradigm. Oh, say I'm an erusi, my sai tai mesen tai, astu on onosus, a saying I sauce. And so, I mean, I tried to make it fun for them to rattle these things off, and I'm thinking like, wow, we can invest that same energy towards developing a more authentic communicative experience. And you know, it's a little less artificial, the fun of rattle things off. I went home after hearing Jason do this communicative workshop, the first one I ever heard you guys do. And I was reproducing some of it for my wife. And she kind of looked at me and she said, Timothy, I knew you knew Greek. But now it actually seems like, now that I hear you speaking it a little bit, it seems like you actually know a language. Yeah. And I don't think that's just her. I think our students feel that way. And they feel that way around their friends, I think. I think that it's actually going to give Greek a chance at a little bit of a comeback on our campus. As people say, oh, like, that's a language. Right. Like, that's kind of a cool accent. Yeah. And you're speaking it a little bit.
And that's a language that every Christian could have ability in and would benefit immensely by having that ability.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we like to say. Like, we never say everyone should learn the biblical languages necessarily, but we do think everyone can benefit from it. And we think for the most part, everyone's able to, given the right environment and resources and everything like that. I think that's what's really, really cool about what's going on here. You know, I like to think that Biblingo has at least something to do with the performance, the retention, the excitement around it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm convinced of it.
But it's absolutely more than that. It's the environment that you guys are creating as a whole, the excitement you're creating around it. So I just applaud you for that. So as we kind of wrap up here, I know you all are kind of recently into this whole change. So I'm sure the process, the refresh isn't completely done. And I'm sure you all know that it's not perfect at this point. But do you have any kind of final advice for anyone in this kind of context who might be considering doing something similar?
Well, we're a continuous improvement operation. We don't believe you perfect anything out of the gate. And, every time I teach a course, I'm changing it. And that will continue in Greek as well. But I would say two things. One, don't be afraid to go big. Don't be afraid. Edwards Deming, the so-called Japanese-style management expert of the last century, said the key to success in organizations is to remove fear from the workplace. Everybody has to be empowered to take drastic action if necessary to fix real problems. And if that means you pull the chain and stop the assembly line and everybody's not producing because you saw something wrong with the widgets, then you pull the chain and you're not going to be fired for that. Okay, so it was really a really important part of the recipe that we do away with the turf protection and the rankings, and the social hierarchy and say, okay, what do we need to do? We're all interested in solving this problem, so we don't need to be enemies. We don't need to be at cross purposes. The other big thing I learned is listen to your modern language faculty.
Yeah.
Listen to the people who are teaching languages that live. And there is so much you can learn from that.
I would toss in there, don't be afraid to take steps in this direction. You can always take a step, and that step may lead to another step and another step. You can always take that first step, and just take the step. There's a step you can take. You can have a meeting and have a conversation. You can ask your dean, can we get all the Greek faculty together and just talk about Greek? I mean, that's a step, and who knows what may come, what other steps may come. But take the first step, and if you try to imagine the end of the journey, you'll say we can't get there. You can take a step. Right now we're meeting every Thursday at 4:00. Ezra is beasting me when it comes to this reconstructed Koine. But every Thursday we meet together and we go around and read a verse at a time, and we're getting better. If you basically,
I should probably start coming to that.
It sounds crazy. If you just throw in a bit of a Spanish accent or something, your best fake Spanish accent to Greek, and you're 10% there, maybe 25.
Roll those R's, baby.
And you just work at it. There's a few diphthongs. If you're trying to use a different pronunciation, it's actually, Greek teachers are smart guys. Like, they can do this. And it seems intimidating at first. You just start doing it together. Jason was throwing out a ton of communicative stuff last night, and the amount that I was tracking with just orally, I am still, this is terrible admission for me to make as a Greek teacher. I am not at the point where I can pop in a podcast of someone reading Greek and reconstructed Koine through the New Testament, and I'm going to go and I'm going to catch it all. But I'm going to be able to catch more and more. Yeah. And when you first start this, all you have to do is stay in front of your students. Yeah. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't be teaching Greek anyway. In other words, you can take steps. Anybody can take steps. You don't have to walk in tomorrow morning speaking Greek like the Apostle Paul. Yeah. You don't have to do that.
Also, the teacher is not the one teaching them the accent or the communicative things. They are learning that from Biblingo. Yeah. And we're learning it alongside with them, maybe a few steps ahead of them. Yeah. And there's no need to be afraid of messing it up because you're not there yet.
I think that's a big hesitation is, well, how will this impact our teaching team, right? And because it's a new method, and it does take some training to be able to facilitate some.
Well, the teacher wants to be the expert, and he's got a lot of his ego invested in that.
Right. But as you mentioned,
but there's something reassuring to my students. When my student says in class, "Shouldn't that verb be pronounced pistevo?" And I said, "Look, son, I've been saying pistuo for 50 years. It's going to take me a while." Yeah. I can't imagine pronouncing that word pishtevo.
Yeah.
It just doesn't communicate with me. And they see that I'm working on it too.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing, and I think students don't really care that much about that sort of thing. I think, like you said, it's just about taking the right steps, and I think not only is it very attainable for your teachers to be able to do this sort of thing, but it's actually, I would imagine, more enjoyable for them if their students are having fun. They're probably having more fun too.
You want to make a teacher happy.
Yeah.
Help the students enjoy his class.
I'd say we don't have this figured out, but we need to be, just like any area of life, we all need to be willing to work at this. And I think Greek teachers should think about this, like as a profession. Whether it's your most prioritized course or not. If in your institution, Greek is what's keeping people from seminary or from that Bible degree or whatever, that's okay as long as it's not your fault. But if it's your fault for not being willing to make some tweaks, to make the courses more appealing, to make it more success-oriented, if there's something you can do that would remove a barrier from someone engaging more in God's Word or engaging more in a program, if there's someone that is just basically walking away from your programs that you believe in because of Greek, if there's anything you can do to fix it, have the courage to take a step. And that's all you got to do, take a step.
Yeah. Did you want to share any last advice?
Well, maybe for Greek GAs out there, don't be shy and be innovative and find someone like Timothy. He really has a ear for ideas and makes it happen. At least for me, in my experience, was that I just needed to find someone like Timothy, and I can say anything, and he will go out for battle for me, and I don't need to be the guy like trying to make it happen. That's
This thing could not have happened without Esdras. He was a key piece of the puzzle. Man.
That's good. Yeah, I think just kind of one last thought, kind of in the business world, especially startup world, something that's talked about a lot is a North Star metric. And there's a lot of metrics that matter, but the North Star metric is like, if there's one thing that we can achieve as a company or a startup, then we will have succeeded. And it sounds like for you guys, that North Star metric is that your students love Greek. And I think that is the key. It's student success is the North Star metric, but in a very specific way. They're successful when they've learned to love it. And I think if that's at the center of your priorities and your motivations and how you're developing your curriculum and everything, then I think everything else will just kind of fall into place.
Nick, we think they'll learn it better when they love it. It's not that we're coming to class eating pita chips and nothing's happening. Like, and that's a buy-in thing with the other faculty. Like,
the North Star metric is that they can exegete accurately using their Greek, but you can't get there. They're not going to get there if they don't love the experience.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that is our metric, is seeing them love it, and we know what will flow from that. Right. That's not opposed to the other goals. It's the most important thing to reach the other goals. Yeah.
And that is all we have time for today. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo.